Hi, this is Paul. I promised in my video I released Wednesday that I would try to do some more Synod content. And as I mentioned in that video, there's a lot of sense making that's going on in the denomination. And that sense making comes out now in YouTube form. It comes out in more traditional forms, such as blogs. Blogs are now traditional. Magazines take so long, they barely come out. I know many people have tried messaging me on Facebook, and I never answer because I hate Facebook and I never look at it, including the messages. Every now and then I have to go there because my mom messages me, and I have to read my mom's message. I got to read my mom's message. It's all I can say, but everybody else's I kind of ignore. But my mom will then find things on Facebook and send them to me via email or another messaging platform that she knows I check regularly that we keep for the family. So she sent me this article, and I thought it's something I want to chew on. For those of you who haven't seen it, my friend Pete Vanderbeek, who was on the first day conversation live stream, Pete's played around with YouTube a little bit. He's got 46 subscribers, but this video that he made about Synod has 1,400 views. So good for you, Pete. Pete's also very active on CRC Voices and has been for years. And Pete's another one of these CRC ministers that I know from Voices, and we became friends through Voices. I thought it was a really good video, and I'm actually going to respond to his response video back and forth, because that's kind of the way we do things now. But so you haven't seen it, check it out. But I really wanted to talk about this piece, because this piece by David Hoekema, I think, really gives you a sense of, well, this is sort of how the Christian Reformed Church would communicate with each other after blogging was there. Now, the Reformed Journal is a very important moniker in the Christian Reformed Church. I have a book here in my office, The Best of the Reformed Journal. I grew up with my father reading the Reformed Journal. And some of the videos that I made about burning the wooden shoes, Henry Staub and this cadre of Christian Reformed intellectuals that came out of the Second World War ready to sort of take on their particular posture of the Kuyperian vision, really, in many days, for many of the boomer generation, sort of, this is the golden age of Calvin College. This is the golden age of the Christian Reformed Church. And really what Synod 2023 does in their minds is the end of a dream. It is absolutely catastrophic. In 2022, they imagined that, well, maybe this was a blip, but as I had been writing and saying on my YouTube channel, no, this is no blip. This is, in fact, their reign is over, and it is about to come crashing down. And so many of the people who are just a minority, but they've tended to be the establishment, they've tended to be the ruling elite in the Christian Reformed Church, are basically last year they were in shock. Now they are in despair. And you can see some of that here in this blog. David Hoekema retired in 2018 from Calvin College, where he had served for 26 years as academic administrator and philosophy professor. Susan B. Hoekema, who contributed extensively to this reflection, retired in 2016 from a career in law in group practice in federal and county courts. David and Susan worship at Sunside Presbyterian in Tucson in winter, and in summer they have been worshiping at Second CRC in Grand Haven. Second Grand Haven is where my friend Tim Blackman is pastoring, and as I mentioned in the previous video, I had lunch with him on Monday because he was up in Mount Hermon for High Camp, which he has done regularly. And I told him I want to get him on the channel to do a Randos interview, and he said he's ready. So that'll come at some point, but he's got to finish up High Camp. But I've known Tim for many years, and he's a dear friend, and so I really look forward to having him on the channel. This David Hoekema, as we get into what he wrote on the Reformed Journal, again, this for a lot of outsiders really is, well, how to describe the Reformed Journal. Is it the Atlantic magazine of the Christian Reformed Church? It has been the epicenter of a particular establishment and regime that, again, for many people in the Christian Reformed Church, was the golden age of the denomination and the golden age of Calvin College. That was where all of this flourishing and this Christian Reformed Renaissance took place. I've obviously done a lot of writing on voices over the last few days because, again, we're doing all this sense-making right now in the wake of Synod 2023. And one of the things that comes up regularly, that I bring up regularly, is class. And because this particular aspect of the Christian Reformed Church where it flourished tended to be in the academy, in the intelligentsia, in a particular sort of middle class, upper middle class, well-educated, and Grand Rapids in many ways was sort of the epicenter of that. And while Grand Rapids and those churches that sort of participated in that, flourishing, churches like Neyland and Church of the Servant and Eastern Avenue and Sherman Street, and to a degree Madison Square, where I worshiped when I was in college. One of the things that's true is because Calvin College and Calvin Seminary, Calvin University and Calvin Seminary are such that almost anyone who is in leadership in the Christian Reformed Church has at one point or another been a member of basically a handful of churches in Classist Grand Rapids East. That will give you a sense of just how foundational that Classis has been for the history of the Christian Reformed Church, especially after the Second World War and in terms of this Renaissance. While this was going on, other aspects of the Christian Reformed Church have been withering. Wyoming, Michigan, maybe I'll pull up a map. Even though Neyland Avenue, I think I heard at Synod, they were founded basically like something like 1917. So they would have been sort of a second wave Christian Reformed church, because the Christian Reformed history really gets marked by these waves of immigration. So they would have been sort of an expansion church. But they're located in the old neighborhood where generation after generation of Christian Reformed people would have been there, and you have a number of churches in this area. Now, if you swing out to a place like Wyoming, Michigan is a place where Christian Reformed churches have been in free fall for a while. Wyoming, Michigan was sort of a blue collar suburb. You had a General Motors plant there. That was the community that my wife's there. They tended to be Baptists. My wife's father was Lutheran and her mother was Baptist. So that became an interesting duality for her growing up. But Wyoming, Granville, these sort of southwestern suburbs tended to be much more blue collar. Calvin College, of course, on the Knollcrest campus would be down here, and then the Christian Reformed Church would sort of expand into this area and continue to grow out. There were Christian Reformed churches on the northeast side, but again, the southeast Grand Rapids tended to be, again, the intelligentsia of the Christian Reformed Church. The Wyoming churches have been in free fall for a very long time. The northeast churches sort of got sucked into Sunshine, which became a mega church for a while under Pastor Lou Vandermeer. And then there were issues arose, and that sort of collapsed Sunshine. So there's just a ton of history that's there that's important for the Christian Reformed Church. But again, Classist Grand Rapids East has sort of been the elite. And David Hoekema, his story bears that out, because this elite cadre tends to be intergenerational. The Plantinga family that had Alvin Plantinga, and I didn't get a chance to have Alvin Plantinga when I was at Calvin. He was gone to Notre Dame by the time I got there. But I had Richard Mao. I had Nick Waltersdorf. He was there for a brief spell. And then I had Neil Plantinga at the seminary. Neil was the youngest of that Plantinga family. Their father was a psychology professor at Calvin, and my mother had their father as a psychology professor at Calvin. So this is the article that David Hoekema wrote, and it really gives a sense of the history that's going on here. Last week's discussion of inclusiveness and church order at the Christian Reformed Church's annual synod evoked memories of an earlier debate that dragged on for decades. And many times as I've talked about this debate, I've talked about the women in church office fight and the ways that this is similar yet different. Could women be ordained to church office? In the 1970s, the CRC Synod formed several study committees in the 1970s, CRC Synod formed several study committees in succession dealing with that question. This is a blog, so it isn't edited, so there'll be those kinds of things in it. Yes, said the first committee in 1973. There are no biblical grounds against it. Yes, said the second committee in 1975. So did more committees reported in 1978 and 1982 with some qualifications. Deacon onlys for now. Rather than move forward with church order changes, however, Synod assigned yet another study committee to explain the principle of headship in church and family. And so I was growing up through this whole debate. I was born in the early 60s, and so I listened. Synodical and Christian Reformed politics were table talk at the table that I grew up in. And people had sides, and this went back and forth. My church was progressive on these issues, and this debate went on and on and on. And again, because the Christian Reformed Church is so familial, these things get personal. Now, it's helpful to note that this way of having synodical study committees has been the general method by which the Christian Reformed Church tries to manage its affairs with respect to these things. The part of Harry Bohr's book about his journey through the Gravamen process, the most interesting parts of this book for me were very much how the Christian Reformed Church tries to manage these things. And the kinds of things he wrote were basically, he told some really uncomfortable truths that while sort of the intelligentsia of the Christian Reformed Church fights over these things, for the most part, Harry Bohr imagined or wanted to believe that this would be, that these debates, at least back a generation before when he was debating reprobation, that these debates would sort of be big communal issues. Well, this wasn't, but women in church office, of course, was, because of course you've got passages in the Bible. Women should be silent. You've got a passage in 1 Corinthians. You've got a passage in 1 Timothy, and so this became sort of the war within the Christian Reformed Church. Now, this class element in the Christian Reformed Church is really critical for understanding the way that these debates go intergenerationally, because synod will represent not just sort of the establishment intelligentsia of people with advanced degrees, but they'll represent also the elders and local pastors and people that are just distributed throughout the U.S. and Canada, and the opinions that they have and the ways that they themselves continue to soak up and sort of assimilate into the broader religious environment of North America, as does the elite intelligentsia. My father, retired seminary professor Anthony Hoekema. Now, I know mentioning this, some of you will right away, you'll perk up your ears, because Anthony Hoekema held what was one of the key prestigious chairs in the denomination, which was the chair of systematic theology. Here's a book by Anthony Hoekema. My favorite of his books is on eschatology. That's the book that I've pulled off the shelf probably most often. You can see that the spine has faded, but the original yellow is on the cover. And this is just basic Reformed soteriology. And Anthony Hoekema, he was, by the time I got to seminary, he was already retired. You'd see him popping in and out of the seminary, the Calvin Seminary section of the library, and you'd see him, in the coffee. You'd see him having coffee with professors, and he was known. He had a reputation for being a very gentle man, a very kind man, and and so in his, basically what he did in his retirement was he basically wrote down his class notes, and they became books sort of following the, my library's in a little bit of disarray because I started reorganizing books and never finished. Following Berkhoff, who was there before him, and I couldn't find my big fat blue Berkhoff systematic theology. And that was sort of the tradition. And so Anthony Hoekema held one of the most important posts in the middle of the 20th century at Calvin Seminary in the Christian Reformed Church, and was a lovely man and a diligent servant, and wrote books that, if you read something like this, you'd have a real sense of the Christian Reformed Church as it was sort of emerging out of the counterculture, not really out of the counterculture, in the midst of the counterculture, and the battles that were going on there. And this was sort of a mature, steady, user-accessible Reformed theology that you could read. And it's nobody growing up in the Christian Reformed Church and having gone through catechism would be surprised by anything he'd find in this book, and it would be warm and welcoming. And he also wrote a book about different cults and sects. Sects, S-E-C-T-S, such as Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, LDS, etc., etc. My father, retired seminary professor Anthony Hoekema, was asked to advise that committee. In our family, we knew of his misgivings about women's ordination. He had welcomed and encouraged female students as long as they aspired to be teachers, not pastors. Now the committee was preparing to argue that Scripture not only assigns husbands headship over their wives and families, but also requires women teaching Sunday school to serve under male supervision. This is one of the ways in which these issues tend to, again, thinking about Rene Girard, mimetic rivals begin to look like each other. One of the ironies of the Women in Church office fight was that women were able to do a number of things that were taken away from them when this fight started to occur, which brought out, in a way, a sort of a neoconservatism as the progressives were trying to continue their work in the church, of course. In 1984 Synod, my father surprised everyone, his family, even his committee, when he announced that on further reflection and study, he could no longer endorse a general principle of gender hierarchy. Headship in biblical teachings, he concluded, is relevant to Christian marriage but not to other contexts. Synod passed the report despite my father's recantation. Ordaining women was therefore out of the question. Susan and I maintained our membership in and very close personal ties to a Christian Reformed congregation that we had helped organize, Church of the Servant. I've mentioned Church of the Servant a little bit. I don't really know their pastors. They went outside the CRC to get their pastors, and so this is something else that has been happening over the last 20 years, whereas before then, Christian Reformed churches pretty much just got ministers that were trained mostly within the Christian Reformed Church. There are odd exceptions, but those exceptions are more and more. And I think this, again, is part of the assimilation process of the denomination into the larger Christian communities in North America. Church of the Servant was sort of a counterculture Christian Reformed church that experimented with liturgy, and so, in fact, was much more high church with respect to their liturgy than many Christian Reformed churches were, but also I'll call them experimental. They met in a school gym, in one of the Christian school gyms, which they did for a long time. Eventually, as I mentioned in my previous video, purchasing ground near the new Calvin campus and building a church there. And as you might have seen in the video that I did with a group of Christian Reformed ministers, they also have had internships. And again, many Christian Reformed ministers that go through Grand Rapids will have ties to these churches. These churches are very influential in terms of shaping ministers. Church of the Servant, even while living far from CRC churches. We could no longer remain in a denomination unwilling to recognize that its rule for church office rose from patriarchal culture, not scripture. It's a really interesting move there, and I sort of want to ask, who told you it was patriarchal? Riffing a little bit on Genesis 3. What exactly, and so of course, okay, scripture is not patriarchal. And what do you mean by that word? And so right away you can sense the broader conversations coming into this conversation. I should mention this piece of writing, which I think is also, to me, it's up there with the Burning the Wooden Shoes article. James Scopp was not in the Grand Rapids intelligentsia. He instead was in the alternate group out there at Dordt College, now Dordt University. And in 2007, at the 150th celebration anniversary of the split off that formed the Christian Reformed Church, he wrote, I thought, a really important article about where the Christian Reformed Church was going to go. And he was, I think, reading the culture well. And one of the things that he essentially wrote was that the Christian Reformed Church in many ways no longer controls its own weather. That the Christian Reformed Church in many ways is subject to all of the influences that are out there in the broader culture. And I don't mean just progressives. I mean progressives, conservatives. We're all swimming in it. And those tensions that are pulling at the churches outside all have their proxies within the Christian Reformed Church as well, which is, I think, part of the reason that many of you have found the conversation going on within the Christian Reformed Church interesting, because it mirrors some of your own experiences. Participating in the life and ministry of Episcopal, Lutheran, and Congregational churches in New Jersey, Minnesota, and Delaware. And so here you can see, again, the point that I made after the Second World War, the Christian Reformed Church, in a sense, begins taking down its walls. And it becomes part of all of the other conversations going on. And so this tension between the main line and the evangelical really begins to intensify in the Christian Reformed Church. So participating in life and ministry of Episcopal, Lutheran, and Congregational churches in New Jersey, Minnesota, and Delaware, Susan and I value the ways in which each proclaimed the gospel and advanced the kingdom. When our daughter sought confirmation in our Episcopal church, we transferred our membership too. For the first time since our baptism, we were former CRC members. For more of that, look at Christian Reformed Fork in the Road, Confessional Identity or Family Ties. This has just been ringing throughout many of my conversations with Christian Reformed ministers. Many who have come into the denomination said, I don't, with all due respect, your family history is family history. It's not the church. I came here for the confessions. And basically what we've seen is that both progressives and conservatives in the Christian Reformed Church are fighting over what is in some ways their family thing. They're there for the Oldie Bowling and the Christian school and all of those things. And the other people coming, especially from other ethnic groups beyond the Dutch, are saying, I came here for the doctrine, and you act like this is your personal property. We moved back to Michigan in 1992 to pursue our careers in academic administration and in the legal practice. To our dismay, the Christian Reformed Church is still barring women from the pulpit. Now, remember, they've joined the Episcopalians. I rejoined the church where my parents were longtime members and where I spent my childhood, Nealon Avenue CRC. Susan followed suit only in 1996 when women called to ministry were at last permitted to serve in CRC churches, 23 years after theological objections had been debunked at Synod. Now, notice she joins only when this particular issue. So she's there for the doctrine too. And I've had people on both sides of this tell me, I'm not going to join a church that isn't affirming. And when I say people on both sides, I mean people in Sacramento. They might participate here, but they won't take their formal membership. It's sort of a little silent protest. Or other people that would participate here but wouldn't become formal members because we ordained women in office. And so it's very interesting the way these issues sort of lurk with respect to people's practice and people's membership. We remained there until, after another move, we joined Susan's parents at their Grand Haven, Michigan church, 2nd CRC, where my friend Tim Blackman pastors. As administrator and faculty member at Calvin, I was deeply grateful and happily surprised to see it becoming a welcoming home for LGBTQ students, even after the community wrestled with difficult questions of gender, sexuality, and marriage. In our ever more polarized society, respectful dialogue on matters of sexuality and marriage is a rare and precious achievement. We discerned a similar spirit in the life of our congregation from time to time. Now, with respect to Calvin, Calvin's been working very hard at this. In many ways, the Christian Reformed position has been, since 1973, and continues to be, that people are same-sex attracted through no fault of their own. They have to figure out what to do with this aspect of their sexuality and how to proceed with it. And so Calvin has done a lot of work with this, tried to be welcoming of people who are same-sex attracted, and they have conversations while maintaining the position of the Christian Reformed Church. Now, I know, having said this, others will point to tweets and papers written by members of the faculty that say, well, can you really straddle this? Have you been clear? And this kind of thing, this kind of discussion normally swirls around Calvin with respect to all sorts of issues in the university. But Calvin sort of tried to work that divide within the Christian Reformed Church, while on one hand officially holding to the position, and on the other hand understanding that students are going to come with a lot of different positions, and it's their job to care for these students. Now, there's some nuance here, because in many respects, the Christian Reformed Church hasn't changed its policy with respect to this. The policy, the posture that the Christian Reformed Church has had since 1973 has really remained the same. And a community wrestling with this is, at least for some people, understood as code for, oh, we're going to get there, imagining that there is a particular destination. It's unusual for people to imagine that, well, I'm going to wrestle with it, but I'm going to eventually rest on a conservative position. But this happens regularly. I got to think about whose names I want to mention, because these names are known and these things are known, rather than digging out names of which could get me in trouble. We'll just use this speech given on the floor of Synod. I thought this was one of the best speeches given at this Synod.
Reservations about the majority report. I told this body earlier.
He's talking about the Gravamen report, because the Gravamen, the CRC's Gravamen situation is kind of a mess, and it clearly needs to be straightened out, and it's actually a very complex thing to do. And so this individual is talking about his journey with respect to affirming or not affirming same-sex marriage, at least in the church.
Earlier in this week that I hold to a traditional biblical and theological position on gender and sexuality. I'd like to briefly tell you how I got there. I was 15 years old when I... Okay,
the sound was a little low, so I'm upping the sound. He said he now holds to a traditional position, and he'd like to say how he got there.
Realized that I was a homophobe. When a male gay member of my family walked up to me in a family gathering and put his hand on my shoulder and said, "How you doing, Brandon?" And I visibly and demonstrably shrunk away from him and removed his hand from my shoulder by moving my shoulder away. And he knew what that meant, and I knew what that meant, which is that I did not want him to touch me. I didn't want anything to do with him. Over the next number of years, I went to college at this institution. I made a number of LGBTQ plus friends here, and I came to the conclusion that the only way I could love and care for LGBTQ plus people was to become fully affirming.
Okay, now, so we went to Calvin, and he came to the conclusion that, well, he should be fully affirming. And he did that at Calvin. I know some people are going to be like, oh, no, see, that's the problem. Nobody who goes to Calvin should be doing that. And again, this is what I talk about when I talk about the mind of the machine. You're not going to sort of control people by managing information. The walls are down. The internet is here. You're going to have to let people go through the process of figuring things out. And that process is going to mean meeting people with different opinions, meeting people with different ideas, working these issues through. And so this is Brandon. Brandon, I didn't see what, I can look it up later, see who he is, but currently a minister in the Christian Reformed Church somewhere, I imagine.
And I continued to hold that position then all the way through my seminary education at Calvin Theological Seminary. My last year in seminary, though, I began to have reservations about holding a fully affirming position. And during the first 2 years of ministry...
And I really like what he does here, because he notes that people are very fluid inside. We don't choose our beliefs. Our beliefs just sort of rise up. And it doesn't mean they're unformed or mysterious. There are beliefs.
Ministry at Brookfield CRC in Classis, Wisconsin, I shifted back to a traditional biblical understanding. That whole process took about 10 years. And specifically, my move back from an affirming position to a traditional position took about 2 to 3 years. And I have reservations that this majority report greatly decreases the freedom for people to go through that sort of wrestling, because it is not simple and it is not quick, and putting timelines and strictures on people like that, I think, short circuits the process. So I would actually move that we table the majority report.
Okay. So again, people evolve, people emerge, and they don't just go one way. And actually, if they have gone through a process and they arrive at some place, and if the process is good, they tend to be a little bit firmer in the place that they wind up. So, okay, let's continue with this. As an attorney, Susan assisted churches with some legal matters, and later she was appointed to the Board of Trustees and then to the Council of Delegates of the Christian Reformed Church. In her leadership role, she gained greater admiration for the prophetic witness and wide-ranging programs of the denomination. Now, part of the problem of all of the external proxy wars coming into the Christian Reformed Church is that words now have a charge like prophetic. Okay, that's leftist. Whereas actually, it's quite a bit, in many cases, if you want to be it's not even majority, minority, counter the prevailing winds, as that one comedian on Joe Rogan noted, all these kids in high school, they want to be rebellious, so they take on a traditional sexual morality, and now suddenly they're standing out from the crowd. But after 6 years of service, she was deeply troubled by the Council of Delegates members' efforts to circumscribe the work of Mercy and Justice Office and to elevate doctrinal purity over compassion. Now you're seeing a tension. Okay, there's doctrinal purity and compassion. Now, of course, I think lurking behind this tends to be a countercultural stereotype. And people have made these points before. Let's say mercy and justice all of these words take on certain valences and become proxies for certain other positions. And I want to get into this question of relationality versus order when I get into Pete's video a little bit. Release of the Human Sexuality Report deepened our fears for the future of the Christian Reformed Church, rather than continue to a process of inquiry and discernment. And again, that tends to be a process of, evolution along the lines of the rest of the country since the counterculture. The report sought to close off debate. And now that's a fair thing that he's saying, in that part of what was unusual about the HSR committee in Synod 2016 was that they dictated that the committee all be basically subscribed to the 73 report, or at least the essence of the 73 report. And that bothered some people because sort of the expectation, you can see this back with the women in office thing, sort of the expectation was that, well, the progressives who basically are the intelligentsia and the establishment, would basically slowly win the fight, and maybe politically the church would draw up a local option and then evolution could continue the same way. But no. So in fact, they decided who would be on the committee. They looked for ethnic diversity. They looked for same-sex attracted individuals, and actually I won't get into all the details. Rather than explore the meaning of faithful Christian marriage in rapidly changing legal and social context, the report condemned loving and covenantal same-sex partnerships as irremediably sinful. You can't remedy that. After the report was adopted in 2022, churches across the continent submitted overtures asking that its harsh and unqualified judgments be tempered by compassion and patience. Just last week, Synod 2023 rejected all those appeals. Now, again, even sort of the framing of this is, well, this is kind of big bad order versus. So I know some of you out there are saying, okay, boomer, that's sort of the valence. And so there's lots of different layers to the sensibilities around a piece like this. Is this the beginning of another decades-long dispute that will cause deep pain to many faithful members, distract the church from every other aspect of its work in the world, and silence respectful dissent? What can we say to parents whose children have forsaken the church, even their faith, because of the prejudice and hostility they have experienced there? He's very careful with his language. When we learn that yet another young adult disowned by his Christian Reformed CRC family because he is gay has sunk into despair and taken his own life, how shall we comfort his friends? I know some of you reading this are really getting triggered. Just hold on to yourselves, okay? The hurt and pain that Susan and I felt listening to hateful and ignorant comments on the Synod floor cannot be compared to the damage done to our LGBTQ Christian friends and their families. And this pretty much, you heard many speeches that were along this line. This pretty much has the template for one side of the debate. Can we remain in a denomination whose deliberations and pronouncements are so devoid of humility and compassion? And this is where I think, including the Jake Tapper CNN comment and others, last year I made videos basically saying the left is going to leave. It's really hard for the left to leave because it has been their house for 70 years. And the shock of these two synods are that it is no longer their house. They no longer have the political power to forestall this. It's the demographics of the denomination has changed. I wrote in a recent article that part of the reason for this, and I've made this argument before on the channel, is that many of the churches that were there in terms of the women in church office fight, churches that would have been the places where this establishment elite that could sort of easily go in and out of the main line, those churches are gone. Those churches in some ways were sort of mainline-ish, and they were in wealthy suburban or urban communities around the country. As the boomers aged, they retired, sold their significant appreciation in their home values, and retired to Grand Rapids, where you could buy a much more affordable home and then be around all the people that were part of your family or you went to college with. And so the churches in northern New Jersey, in greater Los Angeles, in in the San Francisco Bay Area that were some of the more progressive churches in the 70s and 80s simply are no more or are not what they were. And whereas it's been a big debate and a big cause of concern in the Christian Reformed Church when during the 1960s, 50s and 60s, when the old immigrant communities, localities, and zip codes, like where the old Calvin's campus was, like where Neeland Avenue is, those old neighbors, the Dutchmen began to rise in affluence and move out of those neighborhoods into other suburban communities. You had then, during the counterculture and the civil rights movement, the question of white flight. Many of those churches like Neeland tried to stay in the neighborhood and tried to do ministry. Very few had a lot of success with African American communities. But an interesting thing to look at would be to look at the 80s, 90s, and aughts as these boomer CRC elite intelligentsia establishment churches in these world-class American cities also were unable to reach out to people like themselves in those neighborhoods. And for those reasons, those churches died. The churches in the Christian Reformed Church that have not died have been churches generally in rural areas and agricultural areas that have tended to skew more conservative, more populist, and that is, I've used the number before, that is probably 70% of the Christian Reformed Church. And while churches in places like the San Francisco Bay Area, Greater Los Angeles, and Northern New Jersey have basically withered and in some cases gone away completely, churches in many of the rural areas have continued to hold their own, if not grow. Now, there are exceptions around there, and some of you may note the exceptions, and that's right, there are exceptions, but for the most part, this has been the dynamic, and part of that circulatory system that I mentioned in previous videos tended to bring the retiring boomers back to Grand Rapids, and that's part of the reason that Grand Rapids is so out of step with the rest of the denomination. It is difficult to say. Susan had already found the exit door. The human sexuality report compounded her concerns about the church's direction, and 2 years ago, she transferred her membership to our winter church home, Southside Presbyterian in Tucson. So a little bit of internet stuff. Southside Presbyterian is PCUSA, has an affirming statement, and it's interesting if they really want to go to an interesting church in Tucson, they should check out the Village, but the Village won't be affirming. You'll find incredible diversity at the Village. But again, my guess is one of the things that will separate, let's say, this PCUSA church, where did I lose it? This PCUSA church from a church, let's say, like the Village, was probably class. The Village is a very blue collar, even though you do have some college professors, some of them are on Voices. Is sort of a different class. They're much more Xer and millennial than I would imagine PC. I don't know. I've never been to the PC. I don't want to mischaracterize them, but these kind of issues tend to be what we see happening in the denomination. I've not yet followed her out. He is the son of Anthony Hoekema. He is the son of one of those elite families in the Christian Reformed Church. At Sunday worship, in conversations, and in shared projects, my pastors and fellow parishioners in Grand Haven challenged me to search the scriptures and seek the kingdom. And again, he himself is in a church. In my writing and teaching, I'm motivated by the Reformed ideals of inquiry, reading God's word in nature and scripture, and discerning its meaning through collaborative study. The human sexuality report instead brings a simplistic preconception, rigid gender duality to its exposition of both science, scripture, and science. To walk away from a church and a tradition that has shaped me since childhood will not be easy, but two synods have offered us doctrinaire pronouncements in place of dialogue. There have been, they have condemned as heretical followers of Jesus who Come together, gay, straight, trans, queer, in praise and prayer. Is the great healer now inviting us to exit the door from a broken denomination? So this is the sense-making that's going on. And I'll put in a bid for estuary. But yeah, so this is a good example. 23 comments, and I think this is what we're going to see. I admire your thoughtfulness and journey in life. I'm married in 1972. My husband joined the RCA congregation in Holland, Michigan. So that's what's happening. That's what's happening. So yeah, more sense making, and this is going to happen throughout the year. The map when Synod 2024 comes around will be interesting to see, because there are layers to this. Of course, individuals make choices. And again, why, let's say, a split left in the CRC would be so different is that, again, generally speaking, churches tend to split right and leak left. And that left leaking is part of the reason why the numbers are so... It's the 70-30 split that's in the Christian Reformed Church right now. So anyway, yep, that's his piece. And leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Oh, I wanted to make one more point that I almost forgot to make. Let's see if I can. I was talking to Eric, and he was having a conversation on Twitter with Cedric Parcells. Cedric Parcells was the guy who wrote the article in Abide about the gravamen. And Eric mentioned Rita's question on the floor of Synod. That was the video that I played in the Synod Wednesday video. And she was the one who really, Synod sort of came to a head at that moment when she asked, can my children be a part of this church? Cedric said, what the reporter in the chair could have said is that Synod 1964 ruled that the churches can allow disagreement with the confessions provided that the members remain teachable, do not seek to undermine the confessions, and were otherwise reformed. They just can't be office bearers. Eric writes back, thanks for the reply, Cedric. That was my sense as well. And it was my sense as well. That's why there's so much nuance with respect to this. In many ways, there's sort of different levels of subscription based on reasonable expectations of people and their life and teaching. And you saw that in the plea of that one pastor saying, you make this gravamen ruling too tight, and that's actually going to do some damage. I'm going to make some videos about some of my ideas. I might even write or at least collaborate with some people on an overture for Synod 2024 with respect to the gravamen situation, because I've definitely got some thoughts on it. I suspect the floor of Synod would have benefited from the clarity you just displayed here. And again, Cedric speaking from now that he's been on the Abide videos and written on the website, he will definitely be associated with the conservative wing of the Christian Reformed Church. Thank you, Cedric writes. Unfortunately, the reporter and the chair of the committee weren't as knowledgeable as they probably ought to have been. It was very frustrating to watch. Ken DeBoer asks, but can they make profession of faith? Cedric says, I should clarify that Synod 1964 was addressed whether someone had to completely agree with the confessions in order to become confessing members. In other words, to make profession of faith. And the answer is no. People make professions of faith appropriate to their ability. And given some of the children at the Lord's table, things that have happened in the Christian Reformed Church, some professions of faith have gotten younger than before. There are professions of faith made by disabled adults who obviously are not going to comb through the doctrinal life or the standards of the Christian Reformed Church. And so even though Synod 2023 very much sought to tighten many of these things, that tightening happens also within an understanding of the three levels of the church. And one of the things that I keep trying to remind people is that each synod stands alone, and each synod is a body that stands alone. So here, again, you're talking about Synod 1964. You often heard Synod 1975, Synod 1976, Synod 2022, Synod 2023. the Christian Reformed Church is actually governed by the conversations between these synodical bodies. Over time, you'll see things change, and even in David Hoekema's piece, you see the transformations that have happened in the body. So in that sense, the church is very much a living thing, and things go in and out of the consciousness of the church. I've been doing a lot more Christian Reformed Church reading, and so I picked up this book by my old seminary professor, Henry Zwanstra, which I think was his doctoral dissertation, Reformed Thought and the Experience in a New World. A lot of the early fights in the Christian Reformed Church is a very small, very immigrant denomination. We would look at today and think, history is like that. So, yeah, we'll see. But part of what I think we see in the sense making is that a lot of people who hope that the Christian Reformed Church will track mainline are beginning to see the handwriting on the wall, and especially when they sort of mischaracterize for the sake of argument and rhetoric, which there was a lot of on the synod floor, a lot of sort of argumentation that if you pass this, then what? Then they won't feel welcome? Well, that was actually the case at Calvin with respect to what he wrote about Calvin. I know many people that wouldn't go to Calvin because their posture was too non-affirming. And they wouldn't go to Calvin because of the posture of the Christian Reformed Church before Synod 2022. And now again, the argument is with the trajectory, with the direction of the conversations of multiple synods. And that's, again, where we tend to see the trend line. So now I'm ending the video.